Hello, everyone. The title of the October teaching letter is Overcoming Ziglag Moments. Psalm 27, verse 13 says, I had fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. It was Saturday morning, May 10th, 1986. I was still in bed when my uncle, Anthony, called. After he said two words, I didn't hear anything else. Dot's gone. I remember it like it was yesterday. My mom, Dorothy, had died earlier that morning of a heart attack, and her brother had been asked to notify the children because my dad could not. I can't tell you how devastating that was. My mom was 48 years old, but what hurt so much was that she lived less than an hour away, and I always said I needed to go home and see her. The last time I saw my mom was shortly after our youngest child was born in December of 1985, when she had a chance to see her new grandbaby. I may have seen her once or twice after that, but my plan was to always go to see her. I must admit there were times, although not recently, when I beat myself up for not going to see her, and next year will be 40 years since her passing. When the funeral director took care of her body and put her in the casket, because she had not been sick, she looked like she was simply sleeping. From the time they put her in the casket until the time of the funeral, I went to the funeral home 2 or 3 times every single day to see her. The death of my mom was hard, but it didn't compare to the heart-wrenching helplessness I felt when my daughter died. The day she passed, the family had a normal, typical day. My heart goes out to my son because he found his sister in her bed after she had died. My first thought was, Father, I want her back. I want her back. So I went into her bedroom and began praying and calling her back. But then I heard plainly, she's with me. She's not coming back. I can't tell you the joy I experienced when I heard those words. The joy had nothing to do with my emotions. I had joy because I believed in the one in whom I had placed my trust. I had dropped Candace off at the altar many years before because I didn't like what I was seeing in her life. So I said, Father, whatever you need to do, make sure my baby girl gets to you. Please do it. And he did. When you are dealing with a flood of emotions, you begin to wonder if you really heard God. I knew I had, but my emotions were so out of whack that I began to question it. I thank God for my pastor, because the first thing he said when he walked through the door was that he had been praying and asked God if Candace was coming back, and Jesus said, no, she's staying with me. The Bible gives us examples of people who faced difficult situations and how they responded. We're going to look at one example, and I wish I had been at a place much earlier to understand the value of what we're going to see. We're going to begin in 1 Samuel chapter 30. A chapter sandwiched between King Saul's visit with the woman who had a familiar spirit in chapter 28 and the record involving David. On the other side of that record, in chapter 31, is Saul's death in Israel's battle against the Philistines. I mention this because David was not living in Israel at this time. He and his men lived around Gad, which belonged to the Philistines. The king had given David the city of Ziglag as a gift. In chapter 29, the Philistines were preparing for battle against Israel. The king and his military leaders were concerned about David's loyalties, so the king told him to go home. Let's pick the record up with verse 11. So David and his men rose up early to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now let's begin reading 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 1. And it came to pass when David and his men had come to Ziglag on the third day that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziglag, and smitten Ziglag, and burned it with fire, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, either great or small, but carried them away, and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept, until they had no more power to weep. David and his men were shocked, helpless, and disheartened. They had left their wives, their children, their homes, and their possessions when they were with the Philistine army. They returned home to find that it had been raided and burned to the ground. I thought about the emotions I felt with my mom and daughter when my mom and daughter died. 600 men were grieving because they had lost their families and were having a hard time processing what had happened. Now let's look at verse 6. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord, his God. David and the men were upset and were trying to wrap their minds around what had happened. I can see them, husbands and fathers, feeling guilty because they were not there for their families. The verse says David was greatly distressed. The word means to be narrow. It paints a picture of David feeling squeezed. He was being squeezed by his emotions, and he was being squeezed by what he was seeing in his men. For the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved. Sometimes when people are in pain and hurting, they look for someone to blame. The men's grief had turned to bitterness toward David. They blamed him for what had happened to their families and possessions. Even though I had opportunities to visit my mom before she died, I didn't, and the person I blamed was Barry. When Candace died, the person I blamed was Barry. I was her father, and I should have been able to do more to help her. I beat myself up repeatedly, and finally God had to tell me, that's enough. You need to stop. I told you she was with me. You need to stop. I had received a word from God, and he was telling me to believe it. Distress paints a picture of feeling hemmed in, or that the walls are closing in on you. In this verse, we see David's response to being threatened by his men. He encouraged himself in the Lord. The word encourage means to fasten upon, to seize. Instead of focusing on the horrible situation they were in, David chose to focus on the one constant that had always been a part of his life, the God of his people. David knew that God could supply what he needed in that situation. So it's no surprise to me that he writes in Psalm 27 verse 13, I had fainted unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. I also thought about Hebrews chapter 12 verse 1, which says, wherefore seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, referring to the men and women listed in Hebrews chapter 11. What was their witness? These men and women had a faith in God that enabled them to overcome their Ziglag moments. Verse 8. And David inquired at the Lord, saying, shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? I want you to see a lesson I had to learn. This situation did not paralyze David. It made him so angry that he wanted to do something. But before he responded out of anger, he said, let me talk this over with the Lord. He said, let me talk this over with the Lord. There have been times when I faced situations and decided on a plan of action without asking God what he thought about it. I assumed it would work. Ladies and gentlemen, when you do that, you win some and you lose some, but you often lose more than you win. After Candace died, I didn't ask the Lord what I should do, but because I wasn't doing anything, he was able to nudge me. During times of intermittent crying, I read the Bible and worship, and I constantly thanked the Lord for honoring my prayer that Candace was with him. And I still do that from time to time. I say, Lord, thank you that my baby girl is with you. God was able to nudge me in the direction that I needed to go so that I could be whole again, something I desperately needed. Now look at the second part of verse 8. And he, the Lord, answered him, David, pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. When we face situations with no easy answers, we must fix our eyes squarely on Jesus and ask him what we should do, and then be humble enough to do it. Because sometimes he's going to tell us what to do, and we're hoping he tells us something different. But we asked him, and he gave us the guidance we needed. Be humble enough to say, thank you, Lord. Then there may be times we go to God and he says everything that can be done has been done, and there's nothing more you can do. It's during those times we must trust him and rest in him. Now look at verses 18 and 19. And David recovered all the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. And there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. David sought the Lord's counsel before he went on the offensive. Sometimes it takes us a while to get our bearings and to calm down enough to hear the Lord's voice. And sometimes it doesn't happen in the first hour or in the first few hours. It may take a day, it may take a couple of days, it may take a week, but we must be willing to wait on the Lord. Waiting is a faith response. When we pursue the Lord's heart, then we will get the wisdom we need to guide us through the zigzag moments in our lives. I will end this letter with James chapter 1, verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations. Everything I described about my mom and Candace tested what I believed about God and his word. Whatever negative situation you may find yourself in, when we yield to the voice of our new nature, we will find our way to joy. It doesn't mean we're past the pain. It doesn't mean that we're past all the crying. It doesn't mean we're completely past the hurt, but we can have joy because we know our Heavenly Father loves us. We are not going to live in our emotions forever. At some point, we're going to draw the line and say we're done. In Psalm 22, David writes, Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. David understood the depth that our emotions can take us when we are battling zigzag moments. But he said, even so, I am walking through this valley in my life. And let's not forget Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 10. After hearing the reading of the law, the people wept and mourned. But Nehemiah told them in the latter part of the verse, Neither be ye sorry, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. Ladies and gentlemen, when life's circumstances are unpleasant and unexpected, just know that you can still have joy in the pain and in the heartache because it's a valley you are going through. You are walking through that valley and into the joy of the Lord. I'm 68 years old, and I've seen some valleys, but I walked through them because I walked in the strength provided by my Father's joy. Ladies and gentlemen, God will give you the strength to overcome the zigzag moments in your life. All you must do is give him your hand and let him walk with you through it. Here's to overcoming zigzag moments. Barry.